taking those.
Okay.
Yeah, those are online. And I'm taking
All right.
one at another college.
Where's everybody?
I don't know.
I don't know.
The Michigan game.
What?
Michigan game.
Michigan game. Is there a Michigan game tonight? Basketball?
Is there a
Northwestern on
Michigan?
TV,
Oh.
so it would be on
I don't know
TV.
these things.
What kind of a pastor are you?
Exactly. Well, I guess you announced that this is the last class and no one comes. So
Yeah.
that's probably what's happening. But we're glad you're here. Thanks for coming tonight. And so our Truth for Troubling Times class begins next week. So we're going to wrap it up tonight. Wherever we get is where we get, and it'll be done. And that'll be the end of Genesis 1 to 11. Crazy. I counted. This is class number 37. So it's taken us 37 classes to get through Genesis 1 to 11. It's been fun. It's been just a joy to be with you on Wednesday nights. So thank you so much for coming out and hanging out and talking and just working through some really foundational material. So it's really been a thrill and a joy to be with you the last 37 times that we've done this. So next week we start our Truth for Troubling Times, and that's going to be about a 13-week class. So you're going to just be able to come to that. And as I said last week, we're going to teach for about 45 minutes, and then our elders are going to be here and just interact with you, and really informal, but just an opportunity to engage, ask questions, dialogue, and we just want to help you have as many tools as you can have for navigating the times that we'll be living in. So anyway, I hope it's going to be beneficial to you. We're going to take about 6 weeks of that to just kind of lay the foundation, and then another 6 weeks of that to deal with some specific issues that we have to deal with in our culture. Trying not to duplicate what we did last year. So that's kind of the plan, and we hope you can come to that. We'd love to have you for that as well. So that's kind of the plan for the next few weeks and months after we finish tonight.
Is this for
so
me?
questions?
Your notes are in the back there for
All right.
tonight.
Let me pray and we'll begin. Lord, thanks for another evening, another opportunity to gather together, and thank you for each person that's just been a part of this class, and the dialogue that we've been able to have, and the discussions that we've had, and the teaching that has come through these opening chapters of Genesis. Lord, it is so foundational, and it is so critically important for us to understand these things. And so we thank you for the things that we've learned, and we thank you for another opportunity tonight to just come and deal with these principles, and we pray that you'll teach us and instruct us, and we ask, Lord, that you'll bless our discussion tonight in your name. Amen. All right, so we are in Genesis 11, and let me just do a quick review. We're on page 6 of the notes from last week. We did not finish those. I did give you another set of notes for tonight because I think we're going to have to, we're going to move on from the Tower of Babel. So you can go to those notes from last week, Genesis 11, page 6. Just a quick review of what we talked about last night was the Tower of Babel, and we spent some time just talking through that whole event and kind of looking again at verse 5. You remember what they were doing? They were building this big tower and wanting to make a name for ourselves. Verse 4 says they didn't want to be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth, so they build this massive city and tower. And verse 5 just almost comically states the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And it's just this almost this picture of they're building this, what they think to be this massive structure, and God has to come all the way down from heaven to just get a glimpse of what's happening because it's really small in comparison to him. So that's what they're doing. God then confuses their language. He says in verse 7, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. And then he did in verse 8 what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to scatter. They were supposed to fulfill the earth. They were supposed to multiply and spread out over the whole earth. And they refused to do that, so God forces them to do that, which is just a reminder, God will get his way. God will, according to his plans and purposes, accomplish what he is going to accomplish. And he can either do that with us or without us. He can either do that with our willing hearts, or we can fight him on it, but God's will not be thwarted. And so it's just a really good reminder that we can kick against the goads and we can fight God's will, but he will be sovereign and his plans are always good. And so it's always best, obviously, to be complicit with what the Lord is doing and obey him, and he always blesses that. And so he scatters them, verse 8, and then its name, the place where all that happened, is called Babel because the Lord confused their language, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad the whole face of the earth. So that's the event. We drew some implications from that right in the middle of page 6 from last week. It reminds us, first of all, of the danger of pride. And again, just reminding us of how much God hates pride, how much he hates disobedience, how much he hates when we refuse to obey and we become selfishly ambitious in doing our own thing. God never blesses that. And so that's what we talked a little bit about last week. So what I want to do for just a few moments tonight on the rest of these notes from last week is talk about two implications of Babel. One of those implications is language, and then the other implication is race. So there are two, probably many others, but two very specific principles that come out of the Tower of Babel that we need to think about. And the first one is its effect on languages, and then its second effect is on the whole issue of race and racism, which obviously, if you've spent any time in the last couple of years looking at the headlines, major issue in our culture and our society. So let's start first of all with the issues of language. And bottom of page 6, obviously the Tower of Babel explains why everyone does not speak the same language today. And by language, a common definition of a different language is mutual unintelligibility. So this is from Jonathan Sephardi, and he does a good job of helping us explain what a different language means. It's something where there's mutual intelligibility, the inability to understand what someone else is saying. That's different than dialects. And he goes on to describe different dialects are mutually intelligible. So you might have people that speak different dialects of German or different dialects of Spanish even. And it's all similar languages. They can understand each other, but it's different dialects. So when we talk about different languages, we're not talking about different dialects. We're talking about mutual unintelligibility, the inability to understand someone speaking a different language. And currently, there are close to 7,000 languages in the world today. About 6,900 different kinds of languages. And we have to go back to Babel, obviously, to understand that. So the question is, where did all of these languages come from? And where did they originate from? So very bottom of page 6, linguists recognize that most languages have similarities to other languages, and related languages belong to what are called language families. I'm going to show you some examples of this in just a moment, of how many of the languages that we would consider different languages actually are very similar and can be traced back to a language family. And so what I want to get at is that there are about 7,000 languages in the world today, but if you press them back to their original language families, there's only a few. And we think, obviously, that that's connected to Babel. And what happened at Babel resulted in those original language families. So these original language families, probably, top of page 7, probably less than 100, resulted from God's confusion of the language at Babel, and since that time, the original language families have grown and changed into the abundant number of languages today. So the question we have is, how many language families do we think originated from Babel? And our guess is somewhere under 100. If you just look at the number of families that came from the three sons of Noah, so Japheth, Ham, and Shem, you can see where we think that they each came from. So our best guess is there were probably about 78 original language families as a result of Babel, which, if you look then at a couple resources today that provide statistics on language, and I listed a couple of them there. Vista World Languages and Cultures and Ethnologue, they agree that only 94 language families have been ascertained so far. So of the 7,000 languages, most of them can be traced back to 94 original language families, which is pretty close to what we believe would have been the 78 potential language families coming out of Babel. So then the next question becomes, is it feasible for nearly 7,000 languages that we have today to have developed from less than 100 original language families in about 4,000 years? So we believe, Babel was about 2000 BC roughly, and now we're 2,000 years AD. And so in the last 4,000 years, is it possible for us to have developed or originated 7,000 languages from those original language families? And if you just look at English over the years and realize how much that has changed, it's not that hard to imagine how we could have arrived at 7,000 languages. So I put a little chart there in the middle of page 7. And by the way, that first part of Matthew 6:9 is what I'm preaching on Sunday. And so if you wanted to see what it looked like way back ago, so Old English back in 1000 AD, so you're talking, 1100, 1,000 years ago anyway, you can see what that would have looked like, and it's almost unintelligible. That's English. And then you come up to Middle English around 1100 to 1500, and you can see they're starting to become a little bit more intelligible, all the way to Modern English, early Modern English, around the time of the King James Version, around 1600, Our Father, which art in hewen. And then you come up to Modern English in the 1700s, and it looks pretty similar to what we see today. So in 1,000 years, or even less than that, of 700 years, English has changed quite a bit. So it's not that hard to imagine that from these original families, they began to develop and change over time. And so we have a number of different original, a number of languages that have developed from the original families. You can see at the bottom of page 7 just some of the different languages and how they might be grouped. So Romance languages, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, that's one kind of group of languages. And then there's the Germanic languages, German, Dutch, Scandinavian, English. And then the Slavonic languages, Russian, Polish, Czech, and Serbo-Croat, another group. And then the Indo-European languages, Sanskrit, Indian, and then another group called the Uralic languages, like Estonian, Finnish, Hungarian. Those are different language groups, but many of those can be traced back to the same families, back to even what we think was an original Proto-Indo-European language family, the original family. And we think that a lot of those Romance languages, Germanic languages, Slavonic languages all came from that PIE, that Proto-Indo-European ancestor language. So let me just read a few things here from an Answers in Genesis article, which I think is helpful, and then I'll pause and see if you have any questions or thoughts on this. So bottom of page 7, by comparing existing languages with the help of written records, we know that French and Spanish and Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian come from Latin. Based on similarities as simple as the numbers, we can see evidence of a common source language. But Chinese numbers do not resemble French, Spanish, or English much. The first 3 numbers in Chinese are very different than those words in other languages. From evidences like this, linguists can infer family relations between languages and can partially reconstruct proto-languages and whole family trees. Because languages naturally do change over time, linguists generally suppose that all of today's languages were produced by changes that we see going on around us now. However, the explanation hits the wall and fails at the Tower of Babel. So what they're saying here is the secular assumption is that just like there's evolution in the world, there's also evolution in languages. And so there was an original language, and then it all kind of morphed and evolved. And what you have today is all the languages that have just been the result of an evolutionary process. And the question is, does that stand up against Scripture? And we think it doesn't because of the Tower of Babel. So let me just illustrate here a couple things here. The problem is best illustrated by the most widely studied languages of the world, the roughly 449 distinct languages that fall into the Indo-European language family. So what they're saying is, okay, we're looking at what one of those original language families might have been coming out of Babel, a Proto-Indo-European language that today we have 449 languages from. And so 45% of the people in the world speak one of those languages. It includes English, Spanish, Russian, and 446 other languages. All those languages are known to have come from a single source commonly known as Proto-Indo-European. Based on the scant historical evidence, secular linguists believe PIE was spoken in Europe sometime between the 3rd and 7th millennium BC, give or take a couple thousand years. So you're looking at, what's that?
It's pretty definite.
That's pretty definite. You're looking at probably one of those original language families that came as a result of Babel. And what you have today now is nearly 500 languages spoken around the world that likely originated from one of those original family of languages. The next most widely spoken language is Sino-Tibetan group, which includes Chinese. It is estimated to have about 403 distinct languages and accounts for 22% of the world's population. That language family, too, is believed to have come from a common source, but different from PIE. Neither of these distinct languages, however, can reasonably be dated earlier than the miracle of Babel. And then one other thought here, besides these two families, 92 other distinct language families are supposed to exist. There are two possible secular theories. All these language groups came from a single original language, or the language capacity must have evolved and expressed itself multiple times. Both ideas have been advocated by secular linguists, but current knowledge refutes these possibilities. The theory that any language could arise by chance has been refuted logically and mathematically. The idea that the language capacity could come about by chance more than once is even less likely than its evolving accidentally just once. So no one has shown how language families as different as the Proto-Indo-European language family and the Proto-Sino-Tibetan family could derive from a common source. All that to say, there has to be another explanation for the origination of these families, these language families. So where do you get these original language families from? You have to have another source. It has to be the Tower of Babel, which then we believe obviously is what the Bible teaches. So look at that map at the bottom of page 8, and you can kind of see the groupings by color. And Europe would have been that Proto-Indo-European original language group, and you can see how it's kind of transferred over to Russia and over to the U.S. And then Africa would have likely had its own separate original family group. And then you can see China perhaps representing that Proto-Sino-Tibetan original language family group. Could it be possibly that those represent the three different directions that the sons of Noah went? Mm-hmm. It's possible. And the different families that came from them. So all of that to just kind of say, secular theory wants you to believe that languages have evolved, just like there's been evolution within our existence. But really, it's better to say, obviously, biblically, you have to go back to the Tower of Babel. Okay, top of page 9 then, just a quick example here. Look at how similar these different languages are. Don't look at Hungarian. That's a different family, a language family. But notice, just take one example. Notice how similar English, German, Danish, Latin, Spanish, French, Greek, and Russian are. Just compare the word one across the board. It is very similar. Same thing with the word mother and father. They're different languages and different words, but you can see they look very similar. Mother, mutter, more, mater, madre, mer, matera. It has a similar sound to it. Why? Because they all came from the same original language family. Different languages, but all from the same family. And Hungarian's from a different original family group, so that's why it looks quite a bit different. So let me stop there. That's probably more than you wanted to know, and I'm no linguist by any means, but any thoughts just on this? Yeah, Rachel?
Maybe you answer this so you can tell me later, but I wonder, like, I mean, Scripture doesn't say, I don't think, but when God said he was going to split them and change their languages, was it in a moment they all just understood German or Spanish? Like, I'm just using that as an example, whatever the languages were, or was it like one person had to teach now language based on this revelation that, I don't know, God gave to some? I mean, how do you go from, like, you know, speaking a native tongue you've only known your entire life, and then all of a sudden you're speaking German? You know, is it the whole people group now could automatically just speak that and understand it, or do they need to be, I guess, this is speculation, I guess,
Yeah.
I know, but I'm just curious if you've read anything about that or thought more about that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, the text, if you look at the text, verse 7, let us go down there, confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech. Verse 8, because the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. So, I mean, it seems to be that there was this instantaneous, suddenly they were speaking different languages and they couldn't understand each other. That seems to be the way the text implies it, but who knows?
It's wild.
Yeah,
Just think about it.
yeah. You wake up speaking Russian the next day. How crazy is that? John?
What you just said about the map and the directions that the different families separated from Noah's 3 sons, and I can't remember where I read or heard it, but the proposal, just a suggestion, and it wasn't dogmatic at all, but that the confusion of languages may have been threefold, corresponding to the 3 sons of Noah, which scattered them in their 3 separate directions, and then things developed from that.
Yeah.
It does seem from the context that it was more diverse than 3, but when you're talking families, it's a possibility.
Yeah. Yeah, originally maybe there was 3 families, and then as those nations developed further, they have different original families that developed further from that. It's hard to know.
Yeah, they scattered in 3 basic directions, and then each of those fine-tuned
Right.
and further developed.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, Andy.
You might get into it on when you talk about race, but that 3 answers in Genesis talks quite a bit about the 3 wives of the 3 sons, of one of them being very dark skinned, one of them being more of like the Asian skin,
Yep.
and then the very light European skin, and that those are the 3 directions
Yep.
that they went in. That in that those 3 different family groups, that they were the different blends of that Asian,
Yep.
Japanese, Chinese, Korean,
Yep.
those 3 different types of families, and how they could have separated from those basic 3 to however many generations it was later.
It's fascinating. And it is the next section. So, excellent segue. Because I'll show you exactly what you're talking about, Andy. There's on page 10, a Punnett square that shows you how in the world could we have gotten all the different skin tones that we have today. So let me take you through a little bit here of the implications of Babel on race. And as Andy brings up, all of that is best explained by what happened at the dispersion at Babel. So not only did the dispersion at Babel produce major language families, it also resulted in the isolation of small people groups who could not easily mix. So this is important. How do you get from one family, Noah and his sons and their wives, how do you get from them to the vast number of skin colors and eye shapes and hair colors that you see today? It's fascinating how that happens. And so what has to happen is there has to be a separation from each other. So what happens when they separate? They become isolated from the other groups of people that have a greater genetic diversity than they do. And over time, that group that's separated begins to develop its own genetic portrait, expression. If they were all remaining same together and able to populate and have children and reproduce, you have the full variety of the genetic variation within Noah's family available to all of them, right? And you have the full expression of all of those traits. However, when you isolate those people, and Ham's group goes one way, and Japheth's group goes another way, and Shem's group goes another way, now you isolate them from each other. And now you've got an isolated gene pool where what happens is they develop characteristics as they begin to intermingle with each other, and the genetic potential from those other groups is cut off. And so that's what we're getting at here. This is why we begin to see certain physical characteristics within people groups, and we can see the production of different ethnicities that we see today, although there's really only one race, but we look different. Why do we look different? Because as these groups spread out and became isolated, certain features became dominant in certain groups. So they became genetically isolated, meaning that they married and had offspring primarily within their particular group. And as the years passed, each group developed its own culture and ways of doing things. So genetically isolated, as a result of that, certain physical traits became more prominent in each group. These ethnic characteristics are wrongly considered racial characteristics, but there really is only one race, the human race. And so as you look at different people, they have different look to them. Why? Because they're a different race? No. Because they have a different expression of their genetic DNA that has been isolated for now centuries as a result of the dispersion at Babel. All right? So this is best illustrated in skin color. So in reality, there's only one pigment in human skin, and that's melanin. So you don't have people with different skin colors. You have people with different skin tones based on the amount of melanin that you have in your skin. So it's really a misnomer to say that we're different colored, red and yellow, black and white. That almost makes it sound like, we're completely different races of people. That's not the case at all. We're all the same race with just different levels of that skin coloring pigment known as melanin. So top of page 10, all of the skin shades present today were present within the genetic potential of Adam and Eve, from whom we've all descended. Acts 17 would support the fact that we've all come from one man. Every nation of mankind has come from one man, from Adam. And so all of that genetic variability was bound up within Adam and Eve, then brought down to Noah and his wife and their sons and their wives. So Andy was getting at, how is it possible to have different colored skin? And here's an explanation probably for that. Within Adam and Eve, you probably had the full gamut of genetic variation of skin color. So they probably had olive skin. They probably had not white skin and not dark skin. They probably had olive skin halfway in between. Because the only way for you to get everything from white skin to dark skin is to have the original couple or the original family have the variety within them to produce that in their progeny or in their descendants. So you've seen the Punnett square on the right before. I think we talked about it last year a little bit. But we believe that Adam and Eve probably were of that skin tone that's orange color in that Punnett square, which actually represents more of an olive skin tone. They clearly didn't have the white color skin, because little a, little b can only produce what? White skin, right? If you have Adam and Eve both with having that genetic characteristic associated with the skin, you can only produce progeny with white skin. If, on the other hand, Adam and Eve were both capital A, capital A, capital B, the only progeny that they could produce would be people with black skin or dark skin. So the fact that we see the genetic variability today in all kinds of shades of skin make us think that they were probably A, capital A, capital B, little b, both for Adam and Eve. And you can see that from that combination, you can get everything from white skin all the way to dark skin and everything in between. So you can see the different potential combinations on the right on that Punnett square. And so you're going to have people all the way from light skin to dark skin to somewhat dark skin to very dark skin to not so dark skin and everything in between. And so it's just kind of fascinating to think how that could have happened, and probably the genetic potential for all of that was within Adam and Eve, passed down then to Noah and his family, that would have been then spread out as they took their people through the dispersion. So if you have, let's just say for the sake of argument, Ham is the one with a dark skin, darker skin, as he and his descendants go to Africa, well, what happens is they start to intermingle and interpopulate and intermarry and have children. Well, that dominant characteristic becomes more expressed. And then you have the European, let's say that was Shem, who went up to Europe. He's got more of the light skin, and his family group was able to develop that color. And then you had people that went, maybe let's say Japheth line, went more towards China, and they had more of the olive skin. And so you can just see how genetics comes to play in this, and how it's all present within that couple way back on Noah. So thoughts on this? It's just fascinating to me. Yeah.
Just thinking this through, this is kind of portrayed as chaos and confusion. God created the confusion, but we know God orchestrates absolutely everything. So in that confusion, God orchestrated what groups went together intentionally,
Right.
because of the DNA packaging and the DNA portraits that were with them. That was all God designed. Even the confusion of them scattering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So an illustration of that is, if you're going to live in Africa, there's a lot of sun. What do you need?
Sunscreen.
You need sunscreen. Guess what melanin is? A natural sunscreen. So did God in his wisdom and his providence send the people with the darker skin to Africa with the greater amount of melanin? Absolutely, he did. And yeah, and
Well, was it sent, or did the white people die off because they couldn't live close to the equator?
could be.
And just like very dark skin, they don't get the vitamin D living in the northern area or far south areas, so they would die off too.
That's
back
right.
in the days when they did.
So there is a biblical kind of natural selection. That's what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Or the location of where dark-skinned people were 500 years ago, up to about 500 years ago, before mass transits and
Right.
housing, but how the location of the colors of skin and family groups stayed together.
Exactly. Yeah, fascinating. Done.
It's almost an oversimplification, though, because some of the blackest, dark-skinned people I know come from a group of Indians from South India.
Yeah.
And you go to the Amazon, and there's a lot of dark-skinned people in the jungles of the Amazon. So it's not just Africa, it's
It's equator.
around,
Yeah.
but it is, related to where there's a lot of sun.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And
Do you think the climate could have effects on like people's hair color, or like for instance, if you're living in Africa versus in Russia, do you think that could also play into like a little bit to how people look or how people are genetically going to mutate? Like I guess.
I mean, the influences by the environment, you mean?
Yeah, yeah. In addition to the people groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's all part of that. And God has sovereignly ordained that process of how the environment might affect those people, but also has built within them the capacity to to live in those places. So I'd say it's a both and thing. Yeah. So-
The genetics of it too, of like a dog breeder, of wanting to get the smallest little teacup useless poodle is to take the runt of this group and the
Take it
runt
you're not
of
a
this
fan?
group.
I think he revealed a bias.
What you really think about those kind
Right.
of dogs, maybe.
And how those eventually came from a wolf type
Yeah.
dog.
Yeah.
And how through selective breeding, you can get very small people, or you can get very large, or very hairy, or whatever the body type that you.
Yeah. Which I think goes back again to all that genetic potential was within that original animal kind on the ark. So you had one dog kind, right? You had 2 dogs on the ark. That's it, 2 dogs. And from that dog couple, is that the right way to say that? Mr. and Mrs. Dog. You've got wolves, you've got chihuahuas, you've got coyotes, you've got dachshunds, you've got every kind, which is just fascinating to think that God built within the genetic DNA of those original kinds the variety which would later produce all of what we see today. Fascinating. Yeah, Rachel.
I was talking about this with my mom over the weekend because I just was thinking about it while we were talking through the Tower of Babel, and wondering like at what point, I don't know if God's intention was by splitting these people groups that they would remain separate always, because obviously there is a lot of interracial marriage and children who are being produced out of different cultures and races or cultures and backgrounds and things. And I just was wondering not that he says explicitly, but I wonder if it's somewhere along the lines, not that that's a sin to, marry interracially, but I'm curious if, you mentioned in the eternal state, you think there will be nations and people groups. I wonder if we'll be then again kind of separated and there will be no more intermingling of, people, languages and things. So I know in the Old Testament, the Jews had to remain separate. They weren't allowed to intermarry to keep their genetic code pure. And I think intermarriage was prohibited because of the pagan.
Correct.
Right? So I don't know. I was kind of thinking through that and wondering, we obviously don't see it as a sin today, but would it have been back then, or would it have been frowned upon to marry someone from Africa if you were from Jerusalem? I don't know.
Yeah, no, not for any physical or physiological reasons. There were no issues, but as you mentioned, the prohibition against intermarriage was strictly because of the pagan influence that would have come from those nations. So Israelites were not to intermarry with Canaanites because of the effect of the Canaanite religion upon them, which would then tempt them to forsake the one true and living God, which is exactly what happened in Canaan. Right? That's what they did. So that's the prohibition. It's not a genetic prohibition. There's nothing wrong with interracial marriage today by any means. So I think today sometimes there is that stereotype. Well, you're an interracial couple, you shouldn't be dating and you shouldn't be marrying, and that's baloney. I mean, there might be some ethnicity issues you have to work through, but there's nothing in Scripture that would prohibit any interracial marriages by any means, because we're talking one race. We're not talking different races. We're talking one race, the human race. And actually, interesting, bottom of page 10, this kind of goes along with what you're saying. Here's an illustration of the fact that there is compatibility between mixed race individuals, because there is a couple, here's just one example of this, that 2 children born to medium-colored skin parents can produce offspring with a wide variety of skin shades. So here's a couple that had twins in Britain, and they both had the medium skin color tone, probably like Adam and Eve had, and notice they're twins. One's black and one's white. And I was reading up on this, and there have been some people who actually think this is a fraud. They think this is photoshopped, and they think this is a joke, and this didn't really happen. No, this shows you exactly what is capable when you've got the genetic potential within these individuals when they can give offspring that have different color skin. So just kind of fascinating, which just goes to show that there's compatibility between mixed races. So. All right. So last thing here on page 11, this has profound implications. Obviously, there are different people groups who do have ethnic and cultural heritages that can be honored and celebrated, but we're all one blood. And so that's what we need to be saying. I just wish you could say these three things right here today and interject these things into the race discussions. I feel like if this would just end the race discussions and the racial tensions. We know this as believers, the world doesn't get this and the world doesn't know this, but I feel like if you could just say these things and people would get it and accept them, it would end all the racial violence that we're seeing right now. So number one, there are different people groups, but we're all one blood. Number two, Christ died for the human race, not a particular people group. He died for every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And number three, racism is a sin. We have to say that. And I've spoken out pretty strongly against the whole CRT, critical race theory, and intersectionality, and the wokeness issue. I mean, I think we have to stand against that. That is a heinous, godless ideology. However, I agree that racism is a sin, and you should as well. You should say what they're saying, that it's wrong to treat people a certain way on the basis of their skin color. Absolutely, that is a sin. That is not only a human rights violation, that is a biblical violation. So I don't agree with the treatment. I agree with the diagnosis that racism is wrong. I don't agree with their treatment, but we need to say that racism is wrong. And I think as a church we need to be those who are saying that. But I think we can say that without adopting woke ideologies and all those other kind of godless things. So all that comes from Babel. We understand why we have the languages we have, and we understand why we have the races, that's not really the right term, the ethnicities that we have today. So thoughts on that? Helpful, hopefully, a little bit. All right. Got 45 minutes to take you through another genealogy. So, as I said last week, I hope you're loving genealogies. I hope if you take nothing away from this class that maybe you'll read the genealogies a little bit more carefully and just see what is there. So we come to this last genealogy in Genesis 1 through 11. And it is the genealogy of Shem, and we'll also see just a short genealogy of Terah, Abraham's father as well. You can see again that little chart that we've had in a number of notes. This is the 5th and 6th genealogy. So Toledot, we've called it. So Toledot number 5 is the genealogy of Shem. Toledot number 6 is the genealogy of Terah. So notice here that the genealogy of Shem is contained here in Genesis 11, verses 10 to 26. And then the next one, the genealogy of Terah, starts in verse 27 and goes all the way to chapter 25. It's a big section of Scripture. It's a big Toledot. We're obviously not going to do all that. We're just going to kind of highlight a little bit of these. But you can see how, again, these are the markers in the book of Genesis. If you want to understand the book, you've got to understand how these divisions occur. So let me just look at with you verse 10 of chapter 11. Notice the first words in verse 10 of Genesis chapter 11. It says, "These are the records of the generations of." That's one word in the original, Toledot. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Now skip down to verse 27. And notice what it says. "Now these are the records of the generations of Terah." So division number 5 occurs in verse 10. Division number 6 for the book of Genesis occurs in verse 27. And that one takes us all the way into chapter 25. So does it make sense? Just kind of how those markers occur. So we want to look a little bit here at this 5th and 6th Toledot, the Toledot of Shem and the Toledot of Terah. And what we're going to see, obviously, is this is pointing us all the way to Christ. And that's what I love about this, is you get to see what God did in putting the right people at the right place at the right time to bring about the right line that would ultimately result in the Messiah. And you just see the Lord's hand all over this. You can see the bloodline developing, the seed line developing all throughout these genealogies. And we get to see kind of extraneous, extra people that you learn about a little bit, and then they fade off because they're not the seed line. And you pick up another group and they're mentioned, but they're not the seed line. But you see this silver cord running all the way through these genealogies. And that's what we have here. We have another installment of this genealogy of Jesus, which is just fascinating. And we're here in the Old Testament, just in chapter 11, just 11 chapters in the Bible, and we're already seeing this line develop. So we saw back in chapter 5 the line from Adam to Noah. And now here we are in chapter 11, essentially seeing the line from Noah to Abraham. And then you can see the rest of the genealogy that then brings us to David and then ultimately to Christ. So notice from Noah, I'm looking at the little picture there on page 1. Notice from Noah to Abraham, you've got a few individuals. Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, down to Abraham. So this is what we are learning, how we get from Noah to Abraham. And if you're a Jew, remember, when was this written? 1400 years BC. The Jews have just come out of Egypt. And what do you want to know? You want to know, where's Abraham in this? And how did we get to Abraham? Where's the line? So Moses is writing this for them to show them the line and to show them where their nation fits in this whole messianic line. And so that's what's happening here. So what I love about this is you've got the sovereignty of God written all over this thing. He's putting the right people in the right place. And he's accomplishing his purposes as he's building the line that will ultimately lead to Christ. And by the way, there's some implications for us. I mean, this is kind of a side note, but you are right where God wants you to be in his plans and his purposes. He brought you into this world at just this time. Your life is put right where it needs to be. You're born into the family that you were born into. You were born in the nation that you were born in for the right reasons. You were born at the right time. That's what we see in this. God's putting the right people in the right lines to bring about his Messiah, which just speaks of his incredible sovereignty to put all those pieces in place. And the lesson is true for you as well. I mean, there's a reason you're here today and you're not born in Africa 1,500 years ago. There's a reason you're sitting here today, not born in Russia 100 years from now. Why? Because God is orchestrating all of these things to accomplish all of his purposes. So you see the hand of God in this, and you see the purposes of God over all of this, and he ordains each link in this chain that will ultimately bring about his Messiah. So bottom of page 1, why is it placed here? Why do we go from a genealogy in chapter 10 to the Tower of Babel in the first part of chapter 11 and then come back to another genealogy at the end of chapter 11? It's kind of strange, isn't it? We talked about this last week. There's a reason chapter 10 comes before chapter 11. But I'm going to give you another reason why that they may be in this order. Because technically, in the flow of events, chapter 10 it comes after chapter 11. But Moses puts chapter 10 before chapter 11, so we understand the reason why. He comes back to it in chapter 11 and tells us the Tower of Babel was the reason for all these nations and languages. But there's another reason why he may place it right here. Notice the bottom of page 1. The story of the tower also looks ahead by anticipating the role that Abram will play in restoring the blessing to the dispersed nations. By placing the Tower of Babel incident just prior to the stories of Abram, remember that's who we come to in Genesis 12, Abraham and his descendants, the biblical writer is suggesting in the first place that post-flood humanity is as wicked as pre-flood humanity. Let that sink in for just a moment. We're about ready to come into Abraham. And what event is just described before that here in chapter 11? The Tower of Babel. the wickedness of humanity. So what did God do in Genesis 6 when humanity was that wicked? He wiped them all out. He destroyed them all with a flood. And so now you come to the Tower of Babel and they're the same. Nothing's changed. The wicked human heart is still present. They're building towers to heaven to make a name for themselves. And the question in your mind might be, is God going to do what he did with the flood? Humanity's still wicked. Their hearts are still hard and rebellious against the Lord. So is the Lord going to destroy them because of Babel like he did with the flood? Well, where does Genesis 12 take us? Into judgment? No, takes us into hope. Because there's a guy named Abraham. So keep reading the bottom of page 1. God now places, actually before that, rather than sending something as devastating as a flood to annihilate mankind, however, God now places his hope in a covenant with Abraham as a powerful solution to humanity's sinfulness. This problem, the problem of Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, and the solution, Genesis 12, are brought into immediate juxtaposition, and the forcefulness of this structural move would have been lost had Genesis 10 intervened between the two. So you understand what he's saying, what we're saying here? If God had included the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, and then the genealogy from chapter 10 after it, in the order of it, would have occurred, we would have missed something. We would have missed kind of the emphasis. And the emphasis is, chapter 11, you have a Tower of Babel. And you would think that God would judge them. But what's the very thing that comes in chapter 12? The promise of a nation through whom a Messiah is going to come. So from the Tower of Babel, we go to a genealogy that's going to land us in Abraham, which is the beginning of chapter 12. So I think what Moses is doing is he's kind of highlighting the fact that God's not going to judge them with a flood like he did back in chapter 6. He's actually working his plan of redemption, and he's taking us from the Tower of Babel on a straight line through a genealogy at the end of chapter 11 to a guy named Abraham, who's going to be the father of a nation through which the Messiah is going to come in chapter 12. So, that make sense?
Yeah.
Thoughts? Kind of cool just to see how.
The reason was literary and not chronological.
Exactly.
Some of that.
Yeah, there's a reason he's bringing us to that point literarily. All right, so top of page 2, we come to the two genealogies. Remember the one I showed in verse 10, the records of the generations of Shem, and then verse 27, the records of the generations of Terah. So let's look first of all at this line of Shem, and we're going to see how it moves from Shem to a guy named Terah, and then in verse 27 we're going to pick up the genealogy of Terah and see how we get from Terah to Abraham at the end of chapter 11, which then prepares us for chapter 12. So let me just read. We'll try to get through these names together. Verse 10. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And by the way, I want you to notice as I read through this that the length of years that people are living is getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. You can add the numbers up, which I'll do for you in just a moment, but you can see how the lifespans are getting considerably shorter. So verse 10 again, these are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived 500 years after he became the father of Arphaxad, and he had other sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and became the father of Shelah, and Arphaxad lived 403 years after he became the father of Shelah, and he had other sons and daughters. Shelah lived 30 years and became the father of Eber. And remember I said last week that Eber is where we get the name of the Jewish people, Hebrews. They're the Hebrew people. Why are they called the Hebrews? Because they're descendants of Eber. And Shelah lived 403 years after he became the father of Eber, and he had other sons and daughters. Verse 16, Eber lived 34 years and became the father of Peleg, and Eber lived 430 years after he became the father of Peleg, and he had other sons and daughters. And Peleg lived 30 years and became the father of Reu, and Peleg lived 209 years after he became the father of Reu, and he had other sons and daughters. Reu lived 32 years and became the father of Serug, and Reu lived 207 years after he became the father of Serug, and he had other sons and daughters. And Serug lived 30 years and became the father of Nahor. And Serug lived 200 years after he became the father of Nahor, and he had other sons and daughters. And Nahor lived 29 years and became the father of Terah. And Nahor lived 119 years after he became the father of Terah, and he had other sons and daughters. Verse 26, and Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So there's your genealogy from Shem to Terah, who's the father of Abram. So this is, again, a linear genealogy. Remember in Genesis 10, that was a horizontal one, kind of telling us all the descendants of the sons of Noah. Here it's a linear genealogy, just telling us a straight line from Shem to Abraham. And so this is what it's helping us see, this one seed line going all the way through from Noah to Shem, all the way down to Abram. We do believe that this was a gapless genealogy. So some say, well, there's got to be gaps in this genealogy. And remember, the reason people want to insert gaps in these genealogies is to get what? Years. Millions and millions and millions of years. You have to say, if you're going to be a theistic evolutionist, and you're going to get millions or billions of years into the Bible, you have to say that there are gaps in these genealogies. There can't be a gap in this genealogy. Because notice what he's doing. He's telling us the Father and the Son, and then that one becomes the Father, and then his Son, and then that Son becomes the Father, and he has a Son. There's no gaps here. You can't get gaps in Genesis 5 and 11 and 10 genealogies. Yeah?
The other important thing is if you have gaps, then you can kill the historical Adam.
Yeah.
Because if there's no gaps, then Adam was a real person. But if you have gaps, then you don't need an Adam, right? And we went through that earlier. So.
Yeah, exactly. So don't let anyone tell you that there are gaps in these. These are tight. They are strict. They are straight. They are tight. And so that's why it's so important to understand that in these cases, there might be some gaps when you come to Matthew because he's looking at bigger generations. But here, there's no gaps. There are no gaps here in these Genesis genealogies. There's no way to get billions or millions of years in there. So the other thing then, as we said, is you can see the lifespans of these people drop off steadily after the flood. And I put two little charts at the bottom of page 2. Notice Noah, on the left-hand chart, notice Noah. He's living, about as long as everybody prior to the flood. So Adam, Seth, Enosh, Cainan, Mahalalel, Jared. Enoch is the exception because what happened to him?
He was not.
God took him.
He was not. Yeah, God took him. He said, "You're coming home." He got to not die. But the rest of them, I think the average age for all of those pre-flood was like 912 years. And then the flood hits. And notice what happens after the flood. The ages start to drop off, and it's interesting. There's this curve that you can see in the right-hand graph that shows you that there's this steady decline initially, and then it levels out a little bit. From Noah, who lived 950 years, to Moses, who was down to 140 years. Yeah, Shayla.
On the graphs, the left one, I don't see a key. What is the purple and orange for?
Good question.
Is
So
that when they had their kids?
yeah, the purple is when they had a son,
Oh.
and the orange is how long they lived. So Adam, you can see the purple, that represents 130 years. He had Seth when he was 130 years old. So, and then Seth, I can't remember how old he was when he had Enosh, but it was less than 130, 100 years old or something like that. So the purple represents when they had their first son. The full bar represents how long they lived. Yeah, and
Well, and you were saying how the long lives up until Noah, then the flood, then that drops nearly in half. And then at Peleg, it drops again nearly in half, which Peleg's the first generation born after the dispersion at Babel.
Yeah.
Possibly the end of the Ice Age also.
interesting.
And so another big lifespan cut.
Interesting. So there could have been some environmental.
Right. Or now they don't have this big cool tower to live in and they gotta go live in the woods somewhere. Or the jungles or the deserts or.
That's true. That's true. So you start to see them, starting to fade off, and turn to the next page because you've seen this chart before, but to me it's just a fascinating chart. The chronology chart from Adam to Abraham, and looking at their lifespans. I think I've shared this with you before, but notice Adam lived 930 years, and notice that Noah's father Lamech. So notice that Adam died in the year 930, and notice that Noah's father Lamech was born in 874. You're talking 870 years after the creation at this point. So Lamech, Noah's dad, lived at the same time as Adam. And notice then Noah. So Adam dies 930 years after creation. Noah's born 1,056 years after creation. So Adam died only about 100 years before Noah was born. That's shocking, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think, well, these people had to never even existed at the exact same time. No, Noah's dad lived at the exact same time as Adam. They overlapped by, 50 years? 56 years. Yeah.
What I like about that is passing down the stories. Adam could have told Lamech. Lamech could have told Shem.
Yeah.
Shem could have told Abraham.
Yeah.
Of 4 people.
Yeah. It doesn't take long to get the oral tradition down
Right.
from
And
generations.
we're, 3,000 years?
Yeah. Fascinating. So, and then you can see then after the flood, so flood occurs in the year 1656 post-creation, that the lifespans drop off considerably. So Shem lives, so the first group before the flood live an average of 912 years. And then after the flood, notice the lifespans. You go from Shem at 600 years to Arphaxad at 438 years to Selah at 433 years to Eber at 454, then down to 239, 239, 230, down to 148, 205, 175. You can see the lifespan getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. So here's the question, why? Why is it getting shorter? And it's possible, as Andy just mentioned, and I put this in the notes there at the top of page 3, it's possible that the decreased lifespans were because of some environmental factor, that it was kind of a paradise in the pre-flood world, and that was destroyed in the flood. Just below that, some have suggested that maybe the water canopy that was around the earth that came down when the flood occurred, maybe that had some protective element to it. We don't really know entirely, but a lot of creation scientists lately are saying that the best explanation is the accumulation of mutations. So you have mutations accumulating throughout these years. So Adam and Eve born, they're obviously perfect. There's no mutations. The fall happens. They're starting having children after the fall. And those mutations are maybe there to some degree, but not as prevalent. And then you get to the time of Noah, and you've got an accumulation of mutations. Let me read just a few things here. The Genesis lifespans decline according to a well-defined decay curve. That's that curve on the page 2 at the bottom, that kind of curve picture about the lifespans after the flood. Their decay, or the lifespans are being defined now by a decay curve that began immediately after the flood. The biological decay curve found in these biblical texts matches biological decay curves known from the science of mutation accumulation. As mutations add up after every generation, they constantly erode genetic information. So it could be just that finally all of these genetic mutations are adding up. And you say, why did it happen then right after the flood? Because notice a couple lines down, you had at the flood a population bottleneck. See, what is that? Prior to the flood, you've got perhaps millions, maybe billions of people living on the earth. You've got a whole variety of genetic variability. Now after the flood, you've got 8 people. That's a population bottleneck. And so all the genetic diversity from before the flood is lost, and the new human race descends from Noah and his family, who carried all the genes that were eventually passed down to us today. So it's possible that that's what's the cause of these decreased lifespans, is just the accumulation of mutations that are now accelerated in a sense because you've got just 8 people that populate the earth. So for whatever that's worth, just kind of some interesting thoughts on maybe how that happened. I did give you an article. I thought you might just be interested in this. This is kind of more just a side note. I found this today, and I just thought I'd pass it along to you. Long lifespans in Genesis, are they literal or symbolic? What would we say?
Literal.
Literal. Guess what
Biologos.
Biologos says. So again, if you've not heard before, Biologos, headquartered here in Grand Rapids, right next to Calvin College. And they're a think tank that supposedly has Christian theistic views that govern it. But you need to stay away from them with a 10-foot pole. They are heretical. I believe they're heretical. I believe they're trying to force science into the Bible and not let the Bible stand on its own 2 feet. So here's how they answer the question. All of these long lifespans that we just talked about, Adam 930, Noah 950, Methuselah 969, literal or symbolic? So here's how they... Just let me read some of this and you decide, is it better to take their explanation, or is it better just to take the Bible at its word? Obviously, I think I know you know where I'm going, but let me highlight a few of the, or read some of the highlighted areas. Genesis 5 gives very specific numbers for the genealogy from Adam to Noah. If these mean what 21st century English speakers naturally take them to mean, then we'd be committed to believing either that some people lived very long lives in the distant past, or that the Bible's reporting incorrect information. But this is how you can see where he's going with this. Of course, Genesis was not written in the 21st century English, so our concern is not with what these words would mean if they were written by us today, which we partially agree with. Instead, as biblical scholars regularly remind us, we should ask, what do the words mean in the language and culture in which they were written? That's a fair question. We want to know that. But here's where he's going. Notice the next highlighted section. So, since there are clear examples of numbers being used numerically or literally, he's giving examples in Scripture where they're actual literal numbers, and of numbers being used numerologically, meaning symbolically. When we see some numbers in literature from the ancient Near East, we must consider the way in which they were being used. So he's saying, should you take the numbers in Genesis genealogies as literal or symbolic? He says in the next highlighted section, it turns out that these numbers in Genesis 5, and he would say the same thing about Genesis 11, do have some peculiar characteristics when you dig a little deeper. Then he says this gets a little technical, so hold on tight. Which sometimes I say the same thing, but to me this is an indication of, okay, I'm going to try and explain something to you. It's not going to make sense because it doesn't make sense. But just try to follow me. So here's what he says. There are 30 age numbers we can get from Genesis chapter 5. So go back to Genesis chapter 5. Let me just show you what he's talking about here. So just quickly notice in Genesis chapter 5, there's all kinds of numbers that are stated here. Verse 3, Adam lived 130 years, and then his total years were, in verse 5, 930 years. Verse 6, Seth lived 105 years, and then verse 8 says all the days of Seth were 912 years. So you see, there's 30 numbers listed in that chapter. And so he says 3 numbers for each of the 10 patriarchs. The age when a son was born, the number of years the patriarch lived, and then the total of number of years. So he's just saying there's 30, which we agree, there's 30 numbers total in chapter 5. Now, bottom of page 1 here. The first thing more careful observation reveals about these 30 numbers is that all of them end with the digits 0, 2, 5, 7, or 9. You might not think that's too remarkable until you realize that it eliminates half the possible numbers. So 1's missing, 3 and 4 are missing, 6 is missing, and 8 is missing. It is like seeing a list of all 30 numbers that are all even. We wouldn't think that a random distribution of numbers. In fact, the odds of getting all 30 numbers to end with just these approved digits in a random distribution of ages are about 1 in 100 million. So that should make us suspicious that Genesis 5 is merely giving a historical report. Something else must be going on here. So he says it's curious that you've got 30 numbers and they all end in a 0, a 2, a 5, a 7, or a 9. Curious, huh? Keep reading. One option is attaching some significance to the fact that all of the 30 numbers can be expressed as combinations of the 2 sacred numbers 60 and 7 in terms of months and years. 60 was culturally significant because it was a number that Babylonian mathematics was used on, and 7, of course, has a prominent place in biblical symbolism, beginning with the Sabbath. So when we're told that Methuselah, see if you can track this. So when we're told that Methuselah was 187 years old when he had his son Lamech, we can see that 187 equals 60 plus 60 plus 60 plus 7. And then because 60 months equals 5 years, when Adam is said to be 130 years at the birth of his son Seth, that can be expressed as 60 plus 60 years plus 60 plus 60 months. You following this? He's saying there's symbolism in the numbers. So to get 130, you get 60 years plus 60 years, that's 120. Plus you can get 10 more years when you add 60 months plus 60 months. This could explain why all the reported ages end in a 0, a 2, a 5, 7, or 9. These are what common combinations of 60 years, 5 years, equaling 60 months, and 7 years end with. Besides the obvious 0, 5, and 7, numbers ending with 2 come from adding 7 to a number that ends with 5. So if you add 7 and 5, you get 12, which ends in a 2. So, and a 9 comes from adding 7 twice to a number ending in 5.
I wonder how much time they wasted figuring out.
This is from a PhD. And by the way, this is what happens when you get a PhD from a liberal school.
Mm-hmm.
You start seeing things that aren't there.
Mm-hmm.
And he's seeing things that aren't there. Then the next highlighted section, we may never know for sure what significance the numbers had for the ancient Hebrews who wrote the text. Really? Actually, I know what they mean. I don't have a PhD in this, but I know what they mean. They actually mean the age at which they were having kids and dying. That's really what it means. That's it. So notice what he says. The question is whether it is better explanation to interpret the numbers as having some symbolic or rhetorical significance to the original audience, even if we don't know what that is, or that they were just a straightforward listing of numbers the way we would use them today. He's saying, I don't know which way to go here. I don't know if they're symbolic or if they're literal. Knowing what we do about the culture, and in the absence of any persuasive reasons for thinking that the ages of these men were so radically different than they are today, it seems that a symbolic or rhetorical interpretation is a legitimate option and maybe the preferable one. Andy?
Read that sentence in the middle of that bottom paragraph, starting with "not everyone."
Yeah, very bottom. Not everyone needs a PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies in order to read Genesis, but there should be some people in our faith communities who get such degrees and help us read the text more accurately.
Ooh,
We need smart people like him in the church, so we can understand what God wants.
You see what happens when you just walk away from literal grammatical interpretation of Scripture? This is where you end up. You start playing number games and reading something in there that's not there.
And it directly ignores the textual evidence from Genesis chapter 6, where God expressly says that because of the wickedness, he's going to wipe the earth out, and his numbers are going to be 120, which directly implies that he's shortening the duration of their lifespan from what it was. And to me, that's direct evidence that we should take them as literal numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah, so just real quick, exactly, Matt, what does this mean? So where is he going to land? Notice the last highlighted paragraph. Let me just read this. Even if we never know for sure how genres work in the ancient Near World or how long the patriarchs actually lived. Actually, we do know how they lived. We know enough to understand what God expects us to take from the text. So you're saying, well, what's the purpose of studying the Bible then if you're coming away with some symbolic view? Well, he's answering the question. What does he think this teaches us then? Here's his answer. In this case, it seems that the takeaway message is God's providential preservation of a people. The sin of Cain in chapter 4 would have meant death for all, but here in chapter 5 there's a reboot that runs through Seth, which agreed. We make it to the time of Noah, and God starts things over again, which we agree, preserving Noah to carry on the human race. Then the Tower of Babel sends civilization scattering, and God calls Abram to father the Hebrew people, through whom all the people would be brought back to God, which we agree. These genealogies orient the Hebrews' thinking to the past, deep past, and highlight their role for all humankind. He's saying, listen, it's just teaching us the things that we would essentially agree with, but he's totally dismissing the accuracy of the word to get there.
Well, just another note about biologos is within the last week or two, I think it might have been Ken Ham on some social media, but I saw some links that showed some direct quotes from other works of people who are part of or contribute to biologos, and their doctrinal heresies don't stop at just opening the door for scientific based on science, reinterpreting the meaning of Scripture. Their doctrines go way worse than that.
Yeah.
So some very bad theological positions of many of the members.
Yeah. But it's a very popular organization. A number of well-known, supposedly evangelical scholars are a part of it. So, you just need to be aware. This is the stuff that a lot of people are reading in the churches.
It's becoming well known because it's becoming more palatable.
Probably. And it sounds scientific. I mean, you're going to argue with PhDs? You're going to argue with these guys that have doctorates? You're going to argue with scientists? That's why I think the Christian community is so apt to swallow this, is it sounds like it's coming from a professional. But, Shayla.
You had said that people are starting to put like space in between people when they were born, right? And they died and had kids. With this, how are they saying that when they cut it down by half? Are these the same people?
Well, he actually begins this by saying there's no direct connection between these and the scientific theory of evolution. So he's actually saying there's really no connection between what he's saying here and evolution, but he just wants to he wants to explain how he answers the question, are those numbers literal or symbolic? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sort of, yeah. Okay. Daniel?
But I think the other thing that she's getting at is if you shorten all these guys' lifespans, then there has to be gaps in the line.
Right.
So that then you're denying the line again, right? So that's also important.
Yeah, and one other thing that they've done is they've tried to make those years months. So instead of in Genesis 5 and 11 where it says years, they read months into that. Which, if you start doing the math, yeah, Methuselah lived 80 years then instead of, if he lives 969 months, that's like 80 years. But then that means like he had a kid at 6, which is a problem. Right? So it breaks down. It starts to break down real quick when you start doing these gymnastics with these kinds of things. So, all that to say, just take the word at face value. Just take it what it says. If it says years, it's years. And we just complicate things too much. So I just thought that was a little interesting side. So so that brings us, let me just skip over a couple things. I knew we probably wouldn't get to all of this. So what's the point of that genealogy from verse 10 to verse 26? We're back in Genesis chapter 11, so you can go back there. Verse 10 to verse 26. What's the point of that? Well, again, he's drawing a line. Moses is drawing a straight line for us from Noah, his son Shem, all the way to Terah in verse 26. And who's Terah?
Father of Abraham.
He's the father of Abraham. So go to your notes on page 4, because now we pick up in just these last few verses of Genesis chapter 11. We'll end with this. Now we pick up the line from Terah to Abraham. So let me read these verses. Look at verse 27. We're now moving from Terah to Abram. Verse 27 says, "These are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was barren. She had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran." So now we're starting to get some information that's going to help us understand the interconnectedness of the descendants of Abraham. And so we need to learn where Rebekah comes from, and Leah and Rachel come from, and where Lot fits into this picture. So that's why this genealogy is so helpful. You can see a picture of the connection between Terah's sons Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. You can see that Isaac married Rebekah, who was a great-granddaughter of Terah. And, of course, Jacob marries Leah and Rachel, the great-great-granddaughters of Terah. So those are some of the connections. Lot, of course, was Abraham's nephew, his brother Haran's son, Lot. So Abraham and Lot travel together into the promised land. They're connected through the fact that Lot, is Abraham's nephew. So all of this is starting to lay the pieces in place. Bottom of page 4, we know that Terah was not a follower of God. Think about this. Just think about this for a minute. Terah is an idolater. He's a pagan. Abraham's father is a pagan. How do you know that? Look on the top of page 5, because God told us in Joshua 24 that the Lord says, the God of Israel says, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him all through the land of Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him. Joshua tells us that Terah was an idolater. The one that God chooses to be the father of the nation of Israel, through whom the Messiah would come, was raised in idolatry. And Abraham himself would have been an idolater as well, until God saved him in Genesis 15:6, and God regenerates him and draws him to himself. So just think about this, that the whole plan of salvation of Christ coming through the nation of Israel comes through a former pagan idolater who would have worshipped the moon god. Talk about the sovereignty of God in rescuing a sinner like Abraham, who would have grown up in a home with mom and dad bowing down to actual idols. And God takes him out of that environment and rescues him and saves him and brings him to himself, and he becomes part of the line of Christ, the father of the nation of Israel through whom Christ comes. And it's just staggering to think about what he would have been raised in, and how God's sovereign grace just totally transforms this man's life. And you can see the implications. Isn't that us? I mean, even if you're raised in a Christian family, God rescues you. God saves you. And some of you are sitting here tonight, and you got saved out of a pretty wicked, horrible, ungodly environment. And who gets the glory for all of that?
God does.
God does, because he rescues the people whom he wants, and he puts them right in the places that they need to be in order to accomplish his purposes. And so it's just tremendous. I love seeing the sovereign hand of God orchestrating all of these things behind the scenes, not even behind the scenes, he's doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, you have that with Rachel and Leah. They came out of a pagan idolatrous home. You see that with Ruth the Moabitess, a pagan, before she ended up coming back with Orpah, and is in the line of David and in the line of Christ. He just pulls all these people from very unsuspecting places.
Yeah. We're just trophies of his grace. Right? That's it. Abraham wasn't looking to get saved and become the father of the nation of Israel. God sovereignly just totally transformed this guy's life. Took him out of wicked pagan Mesopotamia and brings him over to the promised land and says, I'm going to bless you. That's God's sovereign choice. He did that to accomplish his purposes. And if you're sitting here tonight and you're saved, the only thing you can attribute that to is the sovereign hand of God. His grace in your life to rescue you and do what he did with Abraham. So all that to say, this is an important genealogy, top of page 5, because it demonstrates how the seed line continued from Shem to Abraham. So we go from Shem all the way to Terah. Notice that little picture with the green stars next to those names. There's the line. So the line goes from Shem all the way down to Terah, Terah to Abraham, Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, Jacob to Judah. There's your line. There's that silver cord running right through. And when you come to Genesis chapter 12, now you've got Abraham called into that line. And these verses, and particularly the first verses of Genesis chapter 12, tell us how God brought this man to the land. And I put a little green picture there. You can see he was raised in Ur, which is modern-day Iraq. God called him and his family up to Haran. There his brother Haran died, and his father Terah died, and then God calls him and summons him down to the promised land. And so all of that is bound up in these genealogies. And so now you're poised and ready for Genesis chapter 12. Now there's a person whom God's going to work through to bring a nation to rescue his people and bring the Messiah. So now I wish we could actually go Genesis 12 and 50. Maybe that's next year, because there's just, the line just continues and the plan just continues. But now, after Genesis 1 through 11, we're sitting right on the cusp of Genesis chapter 12 and the Abrahamic covenant and God's plan of redemption that's just going to continue through the Old Testament. So there it is.
We finished on time.
Just on time. We finished on time. Hopefully that's helpful. Thanks for coming. Thanks for a fun few classes. And I hope you come back next week. It'll be the elders and us and working through some stuff on troubling times. So thank you.
First